All right, so thank you for joining us today. My name is Jack Moore. I'm one of the policy researchers here at CTAC. I'm joined by my colleague and fellow policy researcher, Amanda Fletcher. Thank you for participating in CTAC's patient input consultation webinar for Glecaprevir Pibrentasvir, a new medication to treat hepatitis C. We're broadcasting through Adobe Connect. You should be getting audio through your speakers. If we could just quickly test the raise hand feature. So at the top of your screen, you should see a little figure with a hand raised. If you could just click on that, let me know that everyone knows where to find that. You can use that throughout the presentation to let me know if you have any questions. All right. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Canadian Treatment Action Council, otherwise known as CTAC. For those of you who are not already familiar with our work, CTAC is Canada's national civil society organization that addresses access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and viral hepatitis co-infection. We meaningfully engage with a broad number of stakeholders ranging from people living with HIV and hepatitis C, frontline service providers, healthcare professionals, and policymakers. And we work in collaboration to identify, develop, and implement policy and program solutions. So our agenda for today is as follows. We're going to take a look at the common drug review and market access to new medications in Canada. We have a brief video to cover some of those topics. I'll follow that with an introduction to Glecaprevir Pibrentasvir, or GP, and then we'll go into some of the key findings from clinical trials for this medication. And after that, I'll explain how you can have your voice heard as a person living with hepatitis C or as a caregiver for someone living with hepatitis C. And we'll have an opportunity for some questions at that point as well. So let me just pull up our video.
Canada has a unique healthcare system, and sometimes it can be complicated to navigate. Canada's healthcare system is made up of 13 separate provincial and territorial programs and 6 additional federal plans, making healthcare in Canada a shared responsibility between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. A drug can take as long as a decade to develop, and our regulatory review bodies might take as many as 5 more years to conduct thorough reviews. So what's going on during that time? And how do medical treatments get from clinical trials to a public insurance plan? Once a pharmaceutical manufacturer has created a new treatment or molecule, they must take it through clinical trials before bringing it to market in Canada. These trials evaluate whether a drug works and whether it's safe. A drug can take years to develop and study, with clinical trials often involving hundreds of people testing the drug. Manufacturers will create many molecules, but only those that prove effective during clinical trial are developed further. Some molecules are developed and never advance to become a treatment. It is important to consider that treatment development costs a lot of money, and manufacturers will generally seek to recoup those costs. When the manufacturer is confident that they have a competitive, effective treatment, they will submit the drug, along with clinical trial data, to Health Canada for review. Health Canada reviews the drug to determine if it provides clinical benefit and if it is safe. Once Health Canada concludes that a drug is safe and likely to provide clinical benefit, it is approved for sale on the market and can appear on private insurance plans. However, if a drug is to be listed in most of Canada's public formularies, the process is long from over. These are the public drug plans that many Canadians depend on in order to access essential medications. After Health Canada approval, the drug in question is reviewed by another body, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, or CADTH. This agency is funded by the federal and provincial governments except Quebec, which has an independent process. CADTH oversees a process called the Common Drug Review, or CDR, which conducts a review called Health Technology Assessment, or HTA. Many countries conduct HTAs, and there are different ways to measure health technologies. and HTA is conducted not just on medications and drugs, but also on any health technology, like a new pacemaker design, for example. Ultimately, the Common Drug Review seeks to answer the question, is this treatment cost-effective, and will it provide improved clinical benefits to Canadians? The Common Drug Review will assess the drug for listing on public insurance plans and must conclude whether it can provide equal or improved clinical benefit compared to its cost, and whether that makes it more cost-effective than similar treatments. How much money should be spent to achieve how much clinical benefit? Once the CDR concludes its assessment, it sends a recommendation to all health plans, federal, provincial, and territorial, as to whether or not the provinces should cover the cost of this medication and list it on their plan. The CDR will suggest that the provinces either A. List the treatment, B. List the treatment with clinical criteria and/or conditions, C. Not list the treatment at the submitted price, or D. Not list the treatment at all. Most treatments do not get an unconditional listing suggestion, and the majority are either not recommended for listing or recommended with conditions. In fact, in many of their reviews, the CDR has rejected or suggested not to list at a manufacturer's submitted price. Listing recommendations from the CDR are not binding or final. The provinces and territories receive the recommendation and are free to review the drug against their own standards or make their own conclusion from the Health Canada and CDR reviews. This allows provinces to realize local priorities and more closely manage provincial healthcare needs based on their budgets and populations. Each province does this independently, as each is the public payer of their respective province or territory. While many provinces and territories conduct their own reviews, some smaller provinces tend to follow the CDR recommendation and list or not list accordingly. As new drugs are developed and new needs are realized, provinces and territories must be vigilant to maintain a public listing that addresses contemporary local realities and responsibilities. Often, older treatments must be considered against newer treatments to see which contributes the most value for the most reasonable cost. This system is designed to review and respond to new treatments as they are developed, while allowing room for both price evaluation and regional healthcare priorities. Conducting HTA reviews at several levels with room for conditions allows provinces and territories more control over their public plans and healthcare mandates, while still allowing Health Canada and the CDR to review every treatment at the federal level. Timely and reasonable access to effective and safe medicines is a healthcare priority for Canadians, and while the processes described here account for cost, safety, and efficacy, some critics worry that they are redundant, duplicative, and very costly. Additionally, some critics note that the multiple points of review have resulted in some drugs being available on some public plans, but not others. Therefore, not all Canadians have access to the same treatment options. Is there a better way to realize our healthcare priorities at a reasonable price without rushing our review of safety and efficacy?
All right. So just to summarize the drug approval process, the first step is regulatory approval at Health Canada, and here's where Health Canada reviews the new drug submission data to determine a drug's safety and efficacy. At this stage, if results are deemed favorable and the drug treats the condition that it's intended to treat, a drug is issued a notice of compliance, which gives manufacturers approval for the sale of the drug in Canada. In the second step of the drug approval process, all provinces, with the exception of Quebec, which has its own assessment system, participate in the Common Drug Review. The Canadian Drug Expert Committee, or CTAC, reviews the clinical cost-effectiveness evidence for a drug. The Common Drug Review also looks at patient evidence. They collect patient input and want to know what people who are living with a condition and their caregivers think of the drug under consideration. Because many people access medications through publicly available drug plans, this step is particularly important in determining the accessibility of medications in Canada. Third step is to provide all jurisdictions with formulary listing recommendations, so either to list with criteria or conditions, or to not list. It's also important to mention that while the CDR provides a recommendation on whether or not the drug should be listed, it's jurisdictions themselves who determine whether they will list the drug on their formularies and under what criteria based on their own priorities and economic considerations. The purpose of this webinar is to ensure that the voices of people living with hepatitis C are present in this process. By participating in the webinar and completing the survey, you're helping to inform the patient input submission that CTAC will provide to the Canadian Drug Expert Committee. So now that we've covered the market access portion, let's talk a little bit more about Glecaprevir, Pibrentasvir, or GP. And for the rest of the presentation, I'll be using the abbreviation GP when I'm talking about this medication. GP is a new combination direct-acting antiviral medication for hepatitis C. It consists of two component medications, Glecaprevir and Pibrentasvir, that inhibit the production of proteins that hepatitis C uses to produce new cells. Neither of these drugs has been available on the market independently, so they're both new entries into hepatitis C treatment in Canada. The past several years have seen a real revolution in hepatitis C treatment. Direct-acting antiviral regimens have dramatically higher cure rates than the old standard treatment of ribavirin and peg interferon. Clinical trials for peg interferon and ribavirin had cure rates between 45 to 80%, whereas new drugs have shown cure rates of 95% or greater. Many of the newer treatments were also specifically designed to help treat hepatitis C genotype 1, which is the most common genotype in North America. Newer direct-acting antiviral regimens have also reduced treatment times from 24 or 48 weeks to as little as 12 weeks. These newer drugs also have fewer and less severe side effects than the earlier treatments, making them easier to tolerate so that it's easier for patients to complete a course of treatment. And while some of the early DAAs required the use of peg interferon and ribavirin, we've seen increasing numbers of DAAs being released that don't require these drugs to be effective. So given all of these positive changes that we've already seen with direct-acting antiviral treatments, what are some of the goals that we would have for newer entries into the market? One area that we need improvement on is to have truly pan-genotypic treatment options. A lot of the focus of direct-acting antiviral development was on producing an effective treatment for genotype 1, and many of these treatments might not be as effective for other genotypes, particularly genotype 3. While we've already substantially reduced the length of treatment regimens, even shorter treatment regimens are desired to reduce the burden on patients and to decrease the possibility of people stopping treatment prematurely. Along those lines, while many DAA treatments don't require ribavirin, people with harder to treat infections may still need to use this medication and therefore have to deal with the side effects that come with it. So completely eliminating the use of ribavirin for all patients is another goal of new HCV medications. While treatment failure is not as common with newer drugs, it still does come up. So we also like to have drugs that are less likely to develop drug resistance. For any medication, drug-drug interactions limit the number of people who can successfully use them. And because people living with hepatitis C are disproportionately impacted by other health conditions such as HIV, we're particularly aware of that as an issue as new medications come out. We'd also like to see medications that are safe and efficacious for all patients, including people with more advanced organ damage related to hepatitis C or previous treatment failures. So let's talk about GP and what it can potentially offer to people living with hepatitis C. So like many newer medications, it's a once daily pill. It's been designed as a pan-genotypic treatment. We'll look a bit more closely at some of the clinical trial data on how effective it is for various genotypes of hepatitis C. GP is also designed to be taken without ribavirin for all patients. We'll look at some of the clinical trial data for the harder to treat populations and see how efficacious this medication is without ribavirin. The molecules in the drugs are also designed to be highly effective against drug-resistant strains of hepatitis C, and to be less likely to cause drug resistance in the event of a treatment failure. So I'm going to be going through some of the clinical trial data and looking at sort of different groups of people living with hepatitis C, and particularly folks with more difficult to treat hepatitis C. But to begin, we'll talk about people who are living with hepatitis C who haven't developed liver cirrhosis. So these would be people with a healthier liver, but who are still living with hepatitis C. Given that these patients have fewer complications than other people living with hepatitis C, some of these trials looked at using an 8-week course of treatment rather than the 12-week course of treatment that's common for new direct-acting antiviral treatments. Results have been very positive, and we've seen very high efficacy both in those people treated on a 12-week regimen and those treated on an 8-week regimen. And because genotype 3 has typically been harder to treat, there was some specific investigation of how well treatment worked for those folks. And again, we're seeing very high cure rates on par with what we might expect from other DAA treatments. So now let's look at how well the treatments work for people living with liver cirrhosis. These trials included both people with no treatment experience and those who had tried other treatment options that weren't effective for them. So trial M14-172 looked at all of the different genotypes of hepatitis C except for genotype 3. It included both people who hadn't used treatment before, so folks who were treatment naive, as well as people who were treatment experienced, so those who had tried a previous treatment that was not successful. All of these people were given a 12-week course of treatment. The results for both groups were shown together, but overall we see a 99% sustained virological response, which is essentially a cure for hepatitis C. Trial M14-868 looked at a similar group, but in this case only included people with genotype 3. Here the results aren't pooled, so we can see differences between people who are treatment naive and treatment experienced. Again, we see very high efficacy rates similar to other DAA treatments. The treatment experience number is slightly lower, but just for perspective, that 96% effectiveness rate is the equivalent of 2 people failing treatment. These numbers are very similar to those seen in clinical trials for other hepatitis C medications, such as Glecaprevir and Epclusa when used with ribavirin to treat similar patients. So now we're going to be looking at people living with HIV and hepatitis C co-infection taking this medication. The Expedition 2 study looked at a broad group of people living with HIV, HCV co-infection. There were no people included from genotype 5, but I don't believe that was a purposeful exclusion. I think that's just because there's fewer of those folks available for trials. Most of them had no prior treatment experience. People without cirrhosis received the 8-week course of treatment, while those with cirrhosis received a 12-week course of treatment. And again, we see very high efficacy rates. The numbers might look a bit lower for people living with cirrhosis, but again, it's a fairly small sample size, so it skews that number a little bit. And again, for perspective, these numbers are very similar or better than results that we've seen in clinical trials for Glecaprevir, Epclusa, and Harvoni when working with a similar patient population. And another thing to note, this particular trial included all genotypes, whereas the Glecaprevir trial only looked at genotypes 1 and 4, and the Harvoni trials only looked at people genotype 1. So we're seeing for pan-genotypic results for people living with HIV, HCV co-infection. One thing to note for people living with co-infection, this medication is contraindicated for a number of HIV medications. Ritonavir, Cobicistat, and efavirenz can all negatively interact with this medication. So you see there's a number of ritonavir-based regimens that aren't recommended to be used with this medication, and likewise several common combination drugs containing cobicistat or efavirenz would not be able to be taken with GP. So now we'll take a look at people who have had a liver or renal transplant. Well, I think people might be familiar with sort of liver damage associated with hepatitis C. Advanced kidney disease can also be an impact of hepatitis C. And so these are patients who might be candidates for transplant at some point. So the Magellan 2 study specifically looked at how effective this medication would be for those folks who had either had a liver or renal transplant. Most of the participants, so about 4 out of 5, had received a liver transplant. The remainder had received a renal transplant, and none of the participants had liver cirrhosis. So again, we're seeing very high efficacy rates. 98 out of the 99 who completed their treatment were cured. There was one person lost to follow-up, but there's no specific reason why that person didn't complete treatment. So again, we're seeing very high efficacy rates for one of the sort of harder to treat populations. Next, we'll be looking at folks with an advanced renal disease. So the Expedition 4 study looked at the use of GP for patients with advanced renal disease. This included people who are at stages 4 and 5, which are the most advanced stages of renal disease. All of the different genotypes were included in this study, but over half were genotype 1. The medication was highly effective and had similar cure rates to those that we've seen for folks with less complications. One thing to note, there were 2 discontinuations due to adverse events, so side effects of the medication. And if we look at the next slide, so overall, GP has relatively low adverse events for most people, the most common being headaches, fatigue, nausea, and diarrhea. If you look at the overall number of people who were included in clinical trials without renal disease, there were very, very low numbers of people who discontinued treatment due to adverse events. If we look at people with advanced renal disease, as a percentage of the total, it is much higher, but again, still very low. But there were some additional adverse events that people commonly mentioned. So that would be pruritus or itching as a result of the medication, and also asthenia or muscle weakness. So something to keep in mind that we might see slightly more frequent adverse events, although still not particularly common for folks with advanced renal disease. There are a handful of medications that are contraindicated for use with GP. So I've already mentioned HIV medications previously. Also, several statin drugs that are used to lower lipid levels in people with cardiovascular disease are contraindicated. There's been some research that linked severe cardiovascular disease with hepatitis C, and there's been more linking HIV with advanced cardiovascular disease. So for people living with hepatitis C or with co-infection who might be at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, that would be something to consider if they're taking lipid-lowering medications. Cyclosporin is an immunosuppressant medication that's often used when someone has had an organ transplant. So for people living with hepatitis C who have received an organ transplant, again, that would be something for them to consider if they're still taking those medications after a transplant. The other drugs listed, so dabigatran or Pradaxa is an anticoagulant. Carbamazepine is an epilepsy medication. Rifampicin is an antibiotic. And then the last one, ethinyl estradiol containing oral contraceptives are contraindicated. There weren't contraindications listed for insertive contraceptive devices, so like an IUD that has low doses of ethinyl estradiol, but oral contraceptives were contraindicated. So just to summarize what we've seen for this drug in clinical trials, so it's highly effective for all genotypes, similar to or better than existing treatments that are available in Canada. For people who haven't yet developed cirrhosis, an 8-week course of treatment could be an option for them. We've seen sustained high efficacy for patients who have previously taken DAAs and might have developed drug resistance to other drugs. And we've also seen that it is safe and effective for a variety of patients who might have more advanced conditions such as renal disease, people who have had liver or renal transplants, or those who are also living with HIV co-infection. There are some side effects, but for most patients, those are fairly mild, although people living with advanced kidney disease may experience more side effects than others. And GP is also contraindicated for some medications, and of particular note would be a number of HIV medications, as well as lipid-lowering medications for people with cardiovascular disease. So that brings us to the end of the clinical trial findings for GP. So now it's your turn to provide your input on GP. CTAC has developed a user-friendly web-based survey for participants to fill out based on some of the questions that are included in the Common Drug Review. So we're asking for information such as the impact of living with hepatitis C or providing care or support to a person living with hepatitis C, the impact of current hepatitis C medications from what you've observed or experienced to someone taking those medications, questions about adverse events or side effects. So what do you consider a tolerable side effect and what isn't tolerable? The impact that hepatitis C can have on caregivers, and also your experience generally with hepatitis C treatment, in particular if you participated, say, in a clinical trial where you were given GP, what your experience was with this medication. And for folks who don't have experience with it, what's of interest to you and how do you think it compares to other treatments that are available? So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for participating. It's fundamental that the voices of people living with hepatitis C are included in the Common Drug Review. So please don't forget to fill out our questionnaire as well as to provide this link to anyone else you know who might want to get involved. I'm going to open this up for questions. You can send those through the chat function. I should also note that the recording of this will be available on our website. We can also send that out to everyone who RSVP'd for the webinar. All right. Any questions before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you again for joining us today. And please do fill out that survey so that we can add your feedback to the patient input report. Thanks again.